Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. Just when you've seen every frightening dark evil of the year 2022, I have to say to you, oh no, we are just at the beginning of it. And I'm going to start off right here with yet another demonic university professor, yet another who is comprised of nothing but pure evil. Here from Summit.News, brought to you by the great Paul Joseph Watson, we have this. SUNY professor, meaning the State University of New York, quote, "It's a mistake to think that pedophilia is wrong." He claims that there are, quote, "evolutionary advantages to child-adult sex." And of course, it is not child-adult sex, that is rape. But again, I have to point out to you that the dominant worldview in which we live today is atheist materialism. And because these people see us, in the words of Jay Dyer, as just a bag of molecules, the way I like to phrase it is that they see us as a collection of atoms or a collection of subatomic particles, whichever one of those works for you. Of course, it is a natural and inherent outcome of that philosophy to not have any problem with what they are calling child-adult sex, or MAPS, minor attracted persons. And there's always going to be a vile demonic creature like this making excuses for it, if he isn't one himself. So let's take a look at the article. A SUNY professor is under investigation after video clips emerged of him asserting that it's a mistake to think pedophilia is wrong and that there are evolutionary advantages to child-adult sex. The SUNY Fredonia professor Stephen Kirshner teaches libertarian philosophy and applied ethics at the university. And of course, under my view of libertarianism, this would be a grotesque violation of the bodily autonomy of the child, who by definition cannot consent to such interactions, and I'll show you why momentarily. The article continues, as part of his libertarian philosophy, Kirshner believes that society's reaction to pedophilia is what is wrong. See, society is always wrong. That's what you always get from these leftist professors, and I guarantee you this guy is one of what is called a bleeding heart or left-wing libertarian, which to me is not libertarianism at all, because the only true libertarianism is right libertarianism as explained by the great Hans Hermann Hoppe. He believes that society's reactions are wrong and that consenting sexual relationships between adults and children could actually be a good thing, but they can't consent. He says, imagine that an adult male wants to have sex with a 12-year-old girl. That's a child, you monster. Imagine that she's a willing participant. She can't be. She doesn't know what she's participating in. Moron. A very standard, very widely held view is that there's something deeply wrong about this. Gee, I wonder why we have that reaction. It's wrong independent of it being criminalized. Yes, it's morally wrong, regardless of what law says. He goes on to say, it's not obvious to me that it's in fact wrong. So I guess he would allow this to happen to his own daughter if he has one. I think this is a mistake, and I think exploring that why it's a mistake will tell us not only things about adult child sex and statutory rape, and also fundamental principles of morality. He doesn't understand the fundamental principles of morality at all if he's even saying something this psychotic. And then he goes on to assert that there's no minimum age at which pedophilia could be considered wrong. So of course I'm sure that he loved the work of the vile demon Alfred Kinsey and all of the sexual abuse that he and his underlings and those who he paid, including a Nazi who he paid to rape children, as I've covered on this show before.
Imagine that an adult male wants to have sex with a 12-year-old girl. Imagine that she's a willing participant. A very standard, very widely held view that there's something deeply wrong about this, and it's wrong independent of it being criminalized. It's not obvious to me that is in fact wrong. I think this is a mistake, and I think that exploring why it's a mistake will tell us not only things about adult child sex and statutory rape.
I think this whiny, nasally cretin needs to be investigated fully. I think they need to confiscate his computers and his phones and find out what he's been up to. That's what I think.
But also about fundamental principles of morality. Well, there's a couple things to say here. One is, even if you are looking for a threshold, let's say there's a threshold. I'm making this number up, but let's say it's at age 8. Still, that tells you that some adult child sex is permissible. Second, the notion that it's wrong even with a 1-year-old is not quite obvious to me. There are reports in some cultures of grandmothers filleting the baby boys to calm them down when a colicky. Now, I don't know if this is true, but this is sort of widely reported as occurring in at least one culture, and it working, that the grandmothers believe this actually works. If this were to be true, and again, I don't know it to be true, if it were to be true, it's hard to see what would be wrong with it. So, yeah, I guess I think, no, I don't think there's a blanket period beyond which this is permissible. If we're interested in willing participation, which is the way I structured it, then yeah, there's a point below which people aren't willing participants in anything because they don't have intentions or they don't have the sort of mental states that allow for willing participation. But no, I don't think it's blanket wrong at any age.
And you can very obviously conclude from this that he would also support bestiality, much in the same way that Chunk Uyghur did over at the Young Turks, when he talked about that if he could be the universal global dictator, one of the first things that he would do is institute bestiality as being legal.
Let me address the evolution in adult child sex. And again, I'm speculating here, but it's not obvious to me there aren't evolutionary advantages. And here's the reasons to think there are evolutionary advantages. One is when you test.
And another thing I have to point out here is you have to understand that for atheist materialists, okay, since there is no afterlife, there is no God, the thing that they worship is Darwinian evolution. Okay, that's the thing that has replaced it for them in their mindset. All of this vile, decrepit evil that you see flows naturally from that once you have this materialist worldview.
College-aged males, surprising numbers, like over 1/5, show attraction to prepubescent individuals. I assume that's mostly girls. And that's true not only when you ask them, they self-report it, which people have got to be hesitant to self-report it, but when you use the penile responses, which are the kind of true test. So it's fairly widespread among young men, particularly young men in our society. Second, you see it in the hunter-gatherers, right? You see it in all sorts of cultures that are quite different than our own, in places like New Guinea and things like that, Melanesia. And third, you see it historically, right? It was true in adult child sex, true in ancient Japan, ancient China, ancient India, Egypt, even Great Britain. And you see in our closest cousins, the bonobos, right? Bonobos are the...
So you can see the disastrous reasoning here, the so-called logic that because these grotesque violations have happened in other places and in other times, that means grotesque violations are okay now. But you see, these people always fall into relativism and nihilism in terms of their philosophical views. So you could actually easily turn this in upon itself and say, well, then, according to the Nazi worldview, to exterminate those who you don't like is also a good thing. And the only matter that decides the difference in that is who has power and who does not have power. So the Nazis rounding up Jews and homosexuals and gypsies and so on and so forth and exterminating them wasn't a big deal, according to the same logic that this guy's engaging in right here. Because remember, there are groups of animals that will also completely exterminate their enemies.
Closest to us genetically. So if you see the same preference for adult child sex in young males today, in hunter-gatherer societies today, in history, and our closest genetic cousins, there's excellent reason to believe, not excellent, but there is good reason to believe that there's actually a strong benefit to adult child sex. Now, what is that benefit? I'm not entirely sure. It might be that people are getting acclimated to sexuality, or they're getting prepared for a long-term bond, or it might be something else. It might be that you're bonding families together. I don't know exactly what the explanation is, but I would claim that in evolutionary terms, as best we can determine, it's more likely than not there's a strong evolutionary case for adult child sex.
Still the adult child sex. That's always a big seller.
Oh yeah. Well,
I had good friends who said, "Are you crazy? Do not write that book."
Man, listen, you're talking to a guy who for 25 years has been making arguments more or less in defense of adult child sex in classrooms. And I don't know if it's the same argument as yours, but I even authored a piece in the Daily Beast in which I called into question the age of consent laws.
Oh, interesting.
which is,
Yeah.
and I brought to bear the arguments I was making in class, and I'm going to see whether they jive.
You see, so these two sick, demented weirdos think, oh, wow, this is really cool that I've met another sick, twisted, demented pervert. And the name down here says unregistered, and I wonder if that means unregistered sex offender or unregistered child molester. I mean, it is possible, given the subjects they're discussing, that they have more than just an intellectual interest in this disturbing topic. But again, he also says he's taught this in his classes. Okay, so parents, again, when you're talking about sending your kids to the universities, this is the bastion of hell that you are sending them into. These kinds of cretins and creeps and monsters are lurking all over on campuses.
Right.
Because this seemed to be like a paradigm case. There's actually some meta studies which seem to suggest that in some cases, at least with regard to adult males and underage males, that it's not harmful, or if it is harmful, we can't decide whether the harm is due to the sex itself or the fact that society goes berserk over it. And so one of the articles I was reading said, look, this is wrong. We don't need to know whether it's harmful. The empirical question of whether or not there's any long-term harm we could track on this is really beside the point. And I was kind of struck with the question. I thought, well, it's not obvious to me why that is. Right? I mean, the standard kind of other argument is that it's a right infringement, and I wasn't sort of convinced by that argument. And also when it comes to hebephilia rather than sort of adult child sex, so sex with like young teens, it's not clear to me. I mean, look, there's at least some reason to believe that that individuals are, designed by evolution to begin reproduction at that period. So if they're designed by evolution to begin reproduction, it's not clear why it would be physically either harmful or emotionally harmful. And so there was kind of like three different explanations, none of which convinced me.
Notice how quickly they bow whenever the word evolution comes up. I mean, it's just like an immediate thing for them to just kneel down to the ground and say, oh, the great Darwin said evolution, therefore that makes everything okay. And this is the same way that these professorial types react whenever climate change comes up. They're ready to radically rearrange the entire world, to change governments, to change economies, so on and so forth, because certain magical terms are mentioned. It's almost like an abracadabra to them. Evolution, abracadabra, oh yes, whatever else will then follow for them. And thankfully, this lunatic has been placed under some kind of investigation. Hopefully, he will be terminated, so that would at least save a few students from being exposed to this creature, this potential monster. I believe personally that he could be a very dangerous person. And as it shows here in the final paragraph here, last month we highlighted how USA Today had hastily deleted a series of tweets which critics said were tantamount to the normalization of pedophilia after the newspaper cited, quote, science to assert that pedophilia was determined in the womb. Okay, so that's the whole argument that, well, I was born this way, so however I'm born makes everything that I do okay. But then Hitler could say that he was born that way to hate Jews and to want to exterminate people, or Jeffrey Dahmer could say that he was born to want to be a mass serial killer and to eat people and try to turn them into zombies and all this kind of stuff. So born this way is actually not a moral argument at all. But let's move over here when we're talking about brain maturity. When is it that a person can actually consent to things? And if your brain is not fully mature until the age of, say, 24 or 25, it seems very obvious to me that a 12-year-old cannot consent to engage in sex with an adult, or with anyone for that matter. And then they provide us with a fairly handy chart here, which shows you that if you're under the age of 15, you barely even have rudimentary problem-solving skills. So a 12-year-old could most certainly not project out into the future the potential problems there could be with engaging with an adult in the manner that that lunatic was talking about. And indeed, you can see also that they're barely out of the phase of developing sight and hearing, or even learning the basics of how to play a musical instrument. Then I move over here to this from Duke University. Brain maturation is complete at about 24 years of age. And as it points out here, one of the areas of the brain that matures late is the prefrontal cortex, the area important in impulse control, risk-taking behavior, and judgment. See, all of these things would be grotesquely impaired at the age of 12 or 15 or whatever that those lunatic monster professors are talking about, probably because they are very dangerous individuals and they have no interest in understanding the biological basis for these things at all. But they would be saying that people in this range of brain development could make these long-term life-altering decisions rather than where you would prefer them to be, which is in this upper end category here, which is generally where society has placed these kinds of things for very good reasons. But again, all of this is just the tip of the iceberg for how evil and crazy some of the university professors are these days. Now I move over to this from the Post-Millennial. Transgender woman, meaning a man who's masquerading as a female, identifies as a British Columbia wolf. Sometimes I will wolf out in the woods, and I'm sure the professors that we saw would think this is just great and fantastic and totally normal. And here you can see the mask get up that this person gets into as they run around in the woods, imagining that they are a wolf. And again, I welcome you to February of 2022. Next, I have this. Founder of Detroit Satanic Temple kills baby on live TV during interview with pro-life activist. On Sunday, pro-abortion activist Jex Blackmore horrified viewers by taking an abortion pill live on TV and killing her baby. And I'm sure leftists and the Satanists and Luciferians love this. Blackmore was participating in an interview on Fox 2 News Detroit's Let It Rip segment hosted by Charlie Langton, in which she was joined by Rebecca Kiesling, a pro-life advocate and lawyer. Kiesling is an international pro-life speaker and campaigner. She was conceived in rape and has made it her mission to use her story to show others the importance of choosing life despite the circumstances. And then here you can see an image of the lunatic Satanist taking an abortion pill and bragging that this is the third time that she has murdered one of her babies. Next, I'll move on to this article from Zero Hedge. China is undermining the U.S. through elite capture. The United States is currently traveling down a losing path in its battle against China, because the communist regime has co-opted many American elites in Washington, Wall Street, corporate America, and the U.S. tech sector, warned author Peter Schweitzer. And of course, it's all easy to do when these people just worship the great god Mammon. They worship money, and since the universities that they all go through are filled with psychopaths and lunatics. Schweitzer, who recently released his new book, Red-Handed: How American Elites Get Rich Helping China Win, said that his book shows how appalling it is that some elites have been willing to kowtow to the regime just so that they have access to the Chinese market. And I'll have this link below. You can check it out. You'll see the connections that he points out here about Dianne Feinstein and her husband, Richard Bloom. You'll see how the global doctor, Bill Gates, is all completely tied in with China, and that ultimately things just go from bad to worse with Biden in charge because he's completely clueless. Recently, I'm sure that you have seen or heard that the United States has now gone over $30 trillion in debt. And then they offer an interesting visualization here of stacks of $100 bills so that you can see what this looks like. And what it comes out to is basically you could build an entire city of skyscrapers of nothing but $100 bills, and this money will never ever be repaid, and there's never going to be a balanced budget. Those ideas are just total absurdities at this point, and this is all thanks to the Federal Reserve, the creature from Jekyll Island. And if you don't know what I'm talking about there, look it up for yourself and watch the great videos from G. Edward Griffin as he explains it all. Here from Natural News, I have this alert. 37,000 teachers use left-wing news literacy project to indoctrinate children. The news literacy program warns that common misinformation themes include phrases such as "the media won't report this" and, quote, "do your own research." So, of course, it's always bad to go and do research on your own, because then you might find things about these nasty little professors who love pedophilia. The News Literacy Project, or NLP, is a propaganda outlet masquerading as a nonpartisan organization. However, what it actually does is teach school children how to be mindless leftist narrative consumers. And this will, of course, be linked below as well. Next, also from Natural News, Teachers Union purchases NewsGuard licenses for all 1.7 million member teachers to brainwash students with corporate disinformation parading as trusted media. And recall that NewsGuard is controlled by the world's global doctor, Bill Gates, and Microsoft. The American Federation of Teachers wants public school educators to play a much bigger role in combating online misinformation by brainwashing their students into being gullible enough to believe that only corporate media giants are trusted news sources. The union announced that it is now partnering up with NewsGuard, a digital censorship tool that protects Big Pharma, to make its ratings information available to AFT's 1.7 million members, as well as the tens of millions of students that they indoctrinate on a daily basis. However, the conservative-leaning Media Research Center, or MRC, suggests that NewsGuard is not to be trusted. Earlier in the month, MRC warned that NewsGuard has quickly gained a reputation for falsely attacking conservative sites while promoting biased left-wing sites as objective. And it's entirely predictable that that is what they would do. It says here the group added that NewsGuard rates left-leaning news sites 27 points higher on a 100-point scale than right-leaning news outlets. When it comes to the coronavirus, NewsGuard ranks anything that parrots the official narrative, the ever-changing official narrative, highest on the rankings, while downgrading anything that questions the likes of Anthony Fauci or the head of the CDC or the origins of the coronavirus itself. But personally, I do not waste my time on NewsGuard, and I cannot figure out for the life of me why anyone else would either. The next article here is this: Meta is the biggest trap ever laid for humanity. According to the Bards FM host Scott Kesterson, once you get into Meta and you start to interact in Meta, you're building dreams. You're building your experience to the world through Meta. Your hours of work each day will be built around Meta. And at first it will seem okay, and then later people will start to be dulled down. Their senses are muddled down, their cognitive capacities will be dulled down. And as I pointed out to you, they will be building up what they think of as their real world. Meanwhile, in the real physical world, they'll be living in a tiny little hut or a tiny little 4-foot by 4-foot office space, basically. They won't care about the external real world, and they'll only care about their digital. And Meta may not ultimately be the one that does this, but that is where the elite have everything moving right now. It seems that this host indeed agrees with me, as he says here, the outdoor experiences of people are going to be increasingly limited, and little by little the brain is going to dull down to this digital realm. The whole level of infinite creativity that God gave us and the potential of our brain is literally killed at the stem, and Meta is the next step. The idea behind all of this, again, is to trap people into an environment where they will literally never escape. Kesterson pointed out that once you get into Meta and your business requires you to work in the Meta space, businesses can now dismiss people to all go home and have virtual spaces in which they can interact. He said that the physical spaces will be downsized, with people living in their homes and using their Oculus glasses to interact for hours in their interaction space. But of course, it may go further than just Oculus glasses. It'll go to the Neuralink brain implants. And then you may not ever be able to turn off your virtual world or the augmented reality spaces in which we'll be moving around in the physical real world. Here from the Daily Mail, Black Lives Matter's House of Cards is starting to fall. Indiana AG says scam organization that has $60 million is causing him concern. However, he declines to say if he's launched an investigation after California's Department of Justice went after the leaders. So apparently there's some $60 million that the organization can't account for, but the former head of it now has something like 3 or 4 mansions spread out across the United States and I believe Canada now as well. So this is just a griftington process, and a whole bunch of leftists have been taken to the wash with it. And really, I can't say I'm all that sorry for them. How you could trust a bunch of people who say that they are trained Marxists and who advocate for riots and the burning down of cities and don't care about the 30 plus people who were murdered during these riots, well then, that problem is yours, not mine. Also from the Daily Mail, Tucker Carlson lashes Baltimore schools for defending poor student test scores and the mayor for calling him racist after the host said democracy is failing in the crime-riddled Democrat-run city. But it's probably more aptly titled a hellhole. One of the specific schools that he pointed out, Patterson High School, has 77% of the students there classed as having only elementary level reading. And as we all know, the schools there are absolutely atrocious. I've reported on those before. And as we are only here in very early February, as it points out, you can see that there have already been 32 murders in Baltimore. So instead of running around calling other people racist, maybe the mayor there and the powers that be ought to concentrate on reducing the number of people who are being murdered in their city. Maybe if they worried about that, then they could deal with their own problems first. And here you can see an absolutely nightmarish chart of the last 10 years or so of homicides in Baltimore. But it's like this in all of the big blue cities, whether it be Memphis or Chicago or New York City or Los Angeles. And I will close out this episode by playing this.
I think we should keep in mind when we refer to Democrats, we refer to the administration, that there are definitely two groups of Democrats as of today. Number one, there are the millions of loyal Americans who have voted the Democrat ticket. Individuals who are just as loyal, who hate communism just as much, and love America just as much as the average Republican. That's one group. On the other hand, there is that small, closely knit group of administration Democrats who are now the complete prisoners and under the complete domination of the bureaucratic, communistic Frankenstein which they themselves have created. Ladies and gentlemen, they shouldn't be called that administration Democrat Party. To call them Democrats is an insult to the millions of loyal American Democrats. They shouldn't be called Democrats. They should be referred to properly as the Commie Crap Party.
And next I'll be moving over to Rumble so that I can report on COVID and the COVID vaccines, because YouTube is full of a bunch of tyrannical censors. And if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.